I am one of the leaders of Net Impact San Francisco. In my day job, I work at Levi Strauss at the Red Tab Foundation there as a part, it's an emergency aid organization helping Levi Strauss employees through unexpected financial emergencies. And my night job is that I'm one of the leaders of NISF. We are a group of 3,000 strong social impact and sustainability professionals in the San Francisco Bay Area. We host monthly events and also are just a networking group and community for people in the impact space. Next week, or not next week, but next month, we also have another event called Hands on Water featuring Solvatin and the UN High Commission for Refugees. So as a follow-up to this meeting, we'll send you some links about Net Impact and also some information on that next event in case anyone wants to stay engaged in the conversation and with Net Impact. A couple Zoom tips to start off today to let everyone know we are recording this session. It'll be shareable on YouTube later. It would be great also if everyone could have their video on. You'll see at the bottom left of your screen on Zoom, there's a function where you can turn your video on. And we also invite everyone to participate in this discussion today in gallery view. The idea is that we all want to see each other, to see the other people that are here, to be engaged, hold each other accountable. So that's at the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You can switch to gallery view to see everyone. Also in your video settings, if you want to see just folks that are here and have video on, you can hide non-video participants. I want to thank everyone that's here today and purchased a ticket. We were able to raise about $1,900 for the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. It is one of the leading nonprofit organizations helping develop minority leadership in areas of environmental, social, and economic justice. This is super exciting for us, and we're so glad to be able to not just talk the talk and have conversations like this, but also to walk the walk and support organizations and people who have their boots on the ground at the intersection of race, equity, and environment. So thank you all for your donations and your contribution to the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. A little bit about how tonight is going to function. We have 4 wonderful panel speakers who are folks working in sustainability that will be speaking to their personal and professional experience at the intersection of race, equity, and environment. We will also have 2 breakout sessions in between the panel discussion where we'll have groups of 3 or 4 for about 10 minutes, and we have a discussion guide and some questions just so you can get to know other folks that are on the call today, and also so we can discuss with each other and learn how to unfreeze personally and professionally around racial justice. And so, you know, why are we here today? What is this conversation about? Why sustainability? You know, I think everyone understands that we've recently faced a large national awakening around the racial injustice that exists systemically throughout our society in the US and globally, and that has existed for hundreds of years. It's undeniable that we live in a system of white supremacy and systemic racial oppression, but it gives me heart to see in the recent conversation, the recent awakening, that people are starting to understand now that neutrality is not enough, that being colorblind is not enough, being not racist is definitely not enough. And I want to thank you all for being here today, for being a part of this conversation, for engaging and wanting to discuss these things, and working to actively do what it takes to be engaged and to be anti-racist. So thank you all for being here. We need to have these conversations, frankly, in every industry, in every community, in every family, in every friend group, because racism is so pervasive. We have to start and clean our own houses. And so today we are here to focus specifically on sustainability and also more broadly with social impact professionals. And, you know, I'd just like everyone to kind of think about, you know, if you are already in this profession. This is a quote from Joe Makower at GreenBiz in his letter to the sustainability community after what happened with George Floyd a few months ago. What led you to this work in the first place? Was it to protect the unprotected? Was it to ensure the well-being of future generations? Was it to engender community resilience? Was it to create solutions to big, seemingly intractable problems? Or maybe was it simply to make the world a better place? If any of those reasons are the reasons why you are in sustainability, then race is a part of your work and creating better outcomes. It's a part of everything that you're doing, and being anti-racist is a key part of this. So, you know, we as people working to build more just and equitable futures have a responsibility to acknowledge race and to be engaged in this work. And so with that, I want to create some space tonight to invite people to be open-minded, to be patient with yourself and with others, to be vulnerable, to recognize that we're not all perfect. We may not all say the right things, and while words and intentions do matter, our intention here today is to be active instead of passive. It's to unfreeze around racism and racial justice, to move forward. And so on the note of moving forward, I would love to introduce our moderator from the QB team that's helping moderate the rest of the discussion today. QB Consulting is an organization that focuses on ESG specific consulting and has a focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and they've been helping us with this conversation today. So I'll hand it off.
Thank you, Ella. Hi, everyone. My name is Veena Muthusamy. As Ella mentioned, I am a consultant with QB, an ESG consulting firm where we focus on designing people-first solutions, which is unfortunately missing from the business perspective quite often. So I'm going to be your moderator today, and I just wanted to thank you again for joining and being engaged in this conversation. And thank you to Net Impact for using your platform to call your community in. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of context. And while I'm not going to dive into too much detail, I just wanted to remind everyone the importance of knowing the history of the movements you're working within and grounding in that history and acknowledging that reality is not always our sanitized version of reality. And it allows us to understand the evolution that brings us to this point and what we've actively chosen to ignore on the trajectory that we're on. Because we all know that you know, the roots of environmentalism began with the conservation movement in the early 20th century, but it's easy to forget that it was formed through the lens of middle and upper class white Americans and completely disregarded the centuries that indigenous people had lived on this land. If you haven't read it already, last week the Sierra Club released a statement about facing its white supremacist history and acknowledged John Muir's racist remarks against Black people and indigenous communities. So we're just starting to acknowledge that mainstream environmentalism still reflects these early racist elitist principles. And then the modern green movement that was born in the 60s and 70s was activist at its core and brought toxic waste and pollution and contamination to the public eye. So I'm sure we all know Rachel Carson's name. We've read about Love Canal and how 3 Mile Island reawakened the environmental movement. But what about Cesar Chavez in the 60s, organizing Latino farm workers who were protesting against harmful pesticides? I actually live on Cesar Chavez street in San Francisco, and I had to look him up when I first moved there and learn this history. And there's also in the 60s, Black students in Houston who protested against a garbage dump in their community that claimed the life of a small child. So there's a lot of history that we're not necessarily taught. And it wasn't until the 80s that we now call, what we now call environmental racism started getting national attention, again, because of protesters. And it was, and at that time, it was a Black community protesting against dumping PCB contaminated soil that was being dug up from all the highways in North Carolina. Can you guys hear me better now? Ella, is that okay? Great. We're having a little bit of technical difficulty, so I apologize. It's on my end. So, so just to reiterate, you know, environmental racism didn't show up on the national stage really to the 1980s, and it was community organizing that brought that to our attention. So we finally started acknowledging that it was low income and communities of color that bore the brunt of pollution and the country's environmental problems. And so this is when the environmental justice movement really emerged. But in the 90s, the environmental activism that tried to organize against corporate mistreatment of land and communities was deemed radical and considered anti-capitalist. So they really became offshoots. And it became easier for corporations to take advantage of communities of color because mainstream environmentalists didn't protect them. And then with globalization and more visible effects of climate change, that spurred what has morphed into sustainability. So the sustainability movement that we're familiar with today has made a very conscious decision to not include marginalized communities and BIPOC voices in order to have a better chance to be integrated into our capitalist, white supremacist society. So it's important to acknowledge our history and realign on values, because if a sustainable future is our true north, if that's what we're saying that we're all working towards, then we have to acknowledge that true impact doesn't come in a silo. And so the inclusive version, the intersectional version of environmentalism, advocates for both the protection of people and the planet. And it acknowledges that there is a root rot that has allowed for unchecked extraction of value and the disregard of marginalized communities and the earth. And so just to be clear, there have been people doing this work for generations, sitting at the intersection of race and the environment, banging on the doors of the sustainability movement for decades, but we haven't exactly heeded that call. So if we want to fix the foundation, it means tying racial justice to the identity of what it means to be a sustainability professional, and really building this equity lens into everything that we do. The way we engage with our friends, our family, our colleagues, the businesses we support, the way we design solutions, and bringing BIPOC communities into decision-making processes and having more representation at the table. So I just want to emphasize that the onus doesn't fall on the BIPOC community or professionals to make the sustainability space more intersectional. So we have to be very intentional about how we're moving this conversation forward. So we actually have some panelists that are joining us today and sharing their perspective. Again, I just want to acknowledge that we're asking a lot of our Black colleagues these days. There is emotional labor associated with having these conversations. And so I just want to thank all of our panelists for being here. Jarami Bond will be kicking us off. So Jarami, can you unmute yourself?
I'm ready to go. I'm muted.
Great. Can you tell us your name, your title, and why the intersection of race and sustainability matters?
Of course. Thank you, Veena. So I am Jarami Bond, Business Development Manager and Sustainability Strategist working for Technion here in San Francisco. I want to say, again, first and foremost, that I appreciate each and every one of you who are here. I'm here to learn, to grow, to share, to embrace the gravity, but also the opportunity that this moment presents. So to answer your question, Veena, this matters to me because I'm Black and in sustainability. My very existence sits at this intersection, and I don't have the option to escape or unplug from these issues because I live them every day. And so when I first started reflecting on what I wanted to share over the next few minutes, I was a little stuck. I typically start presentations like this traversing the timeline of slavery, segregation, and racism in this country, but I had to remind myself that the resources and the education around those topics already exist. They're a quick Google search away. And so in order to maximize the time we have together, I'm going to instead get personal and give you a window into my experience as a Black man in sustainability, but more broadly in America. And I hope that through my vulnerability, it kind of gives you a sneak peek into what your Black colleagues, friends, neighbors might be enduring alongside me. There's really so much to share, but I aim to distill a lifetime of experiences into a few points that hopefully give you all as allies the context needed to thoughtfully engage with the people of color in your life as we do our best to navigate this 400 plus year crisis. And so I want to start with the double consciousness concept. So this was a term that was coined by W.E.B. Du Bois. The definition of double consciousness is an internal conflict experienced by subordinated or colonized groups in an oppressive society. And I'm going to kind of illustrate that through my personal experience as a Black man in the space. And so when I'm going about my day, I'm aware of and in touch with who I am as an individual, my character, my values, motivations, hopes and dreams. But simultaneously, I'm also aware of the stereotypes, assumptions, generalizations that are widely propagated about who Black men are. Some of them being that we are violent, criminal, or even uneducated. And so when I'm in homogenous white environments, I don't fully feel free to be me, because internally I'm constantly feeling pressure to prove that I'm not what you may think I am. It pushes me to go above and beyond to be as friendly as possible so that others don't know or don't perceive me as a threat. It pushes me to use the best vocabulary possible in certain settings so that I can prove that I'm intelligent. It materializes when I, make sure that when I'm in stores, I never put my hands in my pockets. When I pick things up, I pick them up very, very slowly. And I put them down very clearly so that staff knows that I'm not a criminal. It's why I take extreme measures to not get pulled over for fear that, those could be my final moments. These are real life anxieties that we live with, and oftentimes based upon the way we look, we're assumed to be the stereotype until we've done enough to make non-people of color comfortable enough to view us otherwise. And so this mental, emotional battle is exhausting. It takes up a lot of energy and capacity. When I walk into certain rooms, I can't just be, I have to survive. I have to expend energy to ramp up and ground myself in who I know to be in case I'm met with skepticism due to the color of my skin. And then I go do what I was there to do. And so really, what I hope you all take away from this is just the importance of engaging with the people of color in your life with grace, empathy, and understanding of this inward battle, recognizing that none of us are the exception. I've encountered a lot of people who have insinuated that, due to my education or career status or achievements, that I'm exempt from all of this. There's no way that Jarami runs into things that we see on social media or on TV. But I think, a lot of people fail to realize that, there's so many people that don't value Black lives, and it doesn't really take much for us, in spite of our credentials, to end up in these, kind of fight or flight, life or death situations. And so I think, going back to sustainability, this is why we need more representation in our space. I think about how when I attend sustainability events, when I see and meet another Black person, I feel so much refuge, because in that encounter, that short encounter, I know I can just be, even if it's just for a few minutes. And even if we, just make eye contact from across the room, we communicate, I see you, I know what you're going through, stay strong. And I feel like, if we increase representation in our space, the sustainability movement becomes it just becomes a safer space for all. And so that's, kind of the first thing I wanted to talk about. And with the time I have remaining, I want to dive a little deeper into representation. And so I care really deeply about this in our space. I engage in conversations on the matter, and I've been told that sustainability isn't diverse because Black kids aren't interested in the environment. And then I'm asked, what exactly can we do to attract more Black kids to the environmental space? And this perspective, this question, it breaks my heart every time, because I think back to my childhood. My parents enrolled me in several camps and programs at our local nature center. All of my counterparts were Black. hundreds of us over the years. I remember, us innocently dissecting owl pellets, going on hikes, identifying leaves, turning over rocks to see if there were grubs underneath. Like, we were about that life, right? And I'd say that there's just as many Black kids interested in the environment as white kids. Our community has deep connections to the earth, dating back to our days in Africa all the way through slavery, but that's a different conversation. But here's the thing: I think Black kids, these Black kids at the Nature Center, they grow up and typically gravitate to environments that look like them, environments that invite them in, and once they're in, truly accept them. And I think the absence of these elements is where the disconnect begins. And then on top of that, there's the systemic societal dynamics that begin to create a wider divide, creating more obstacles for students to, that prevent students from pursuing what they're truly passionate about. And so, then on top of that, it's also difficult to have the time and energy to thoroughly explore every track when survival is top of mind. We don't have privilege to do so. And so I think, one of the biggest takeaways from this, I hope, is that we, find ways to illuminate pathways for students of color to enter careers in our space that they want to pursue. Instead of, blindly throwing money, let's create programs and tangible pathways that provide direct access to opportunities so that we can really be about the change that we often discuss. And so as I come to the end of my time, I need to wrap it up before they start playing the music. I heard a really interesting analogy the other day from STEM storyteller and biomimicry expert Billy Alman, a Black man, and he talked about how decomposers play a huge role in ecosystems. He compared decomposers to us right now, us on this call. We're spending time trying to figure out how to decompose white supremacy, how, and within that, we're taking down statues, we're fighting the racist ideals, we're having the hard conversations. But people often forget that decomposers are also producers. They break things down and turn them into nutrients. And so I just, he shared this with me and another group, and I want to share this with you all, that, as we break down what's toxic, as we decompose what's toxic, let's make sure that we replace these things with the nutrients that will sprout a new narrative, a narrative of health and just thriving overall for the Black community in this country. And so, if not us, then who? As sustainability professionals, we work with purpose. That's what brought us to this space, as Ella so eloquently shared in the beginning. And so let's take some of that passion that we have and really invest it into creating this new narrative. So with that, I will pass it back to Veena, and thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jarami. I think that actually transitions perfectly to Taylor Price, who's going to be our next panelist, and discussing a bit about the accessibility or lack thereof into the sustainability profession. So Taylor, can you unmute yourself?
Hi everyone, let me know if you can hear me.
Yeah, perfectly. So if you can also give us your name, title, and why the intersection of race and sustainability matters.
Yeah, so again, everyone, Taylor Price here in North Carolina, where I work for a global packaging company on their corporate sustainability team. So my role is very much a traditional corporate sustainability role. So sustainability reports, strategy, targets, working with investors and customers and people all over the globe on sustainability issues. And so for me, sustainability is really important because the environment impacts everything. So it really impacts where we live, where we work, where we play, how we see the world around us. And so I do think it's one of those things that everyone shares and everyone does care about in some way. But I think a lot of us are maybe not able to make that our main focus or our career path, but we do care. We want our children to have a better life. We want, the generations after us to have clean water and food and things like that. So it's something that we all do care about, but I think having the privilege to kind of dedicate your life's work to that is something that a lot of people aren't able to do. So for me, it's really about not only making a difference, but also, kind of leaving this place a little bit better as we go along. And yeah.
I was just going to ask, I know we've talked about this before, if you could speak to a bit how BIPOC communities define success and how that affects your career paths, and just speak to a little bit about the inherent privilege that we have as sustainability professionals.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, especially kind of tying into what Jarami just shared of, being in the environmental space. Everyone cares, all kids are curious about that, but there's some kind of intrinsic barriers to things. And I think what a lot of people say is, oh, if you're a low income, that's a barrier. Or if you're Black, that's a barrier. And I think it's really important to remember that those things are not necessarily the barriers. The systems around those things are the barriers, right? So being Black or Latinx is not the barrier, right? White supremacy is the barrier. Being a woman isn't a barrier. It's the patriarchy or sexism that's the barrier. It's really those inherent systemic things that are the barriers. And so I think, as a sustainability professional, that's something that we have to be aware of, especially in our language. And as sustainability kind of moves from strictly just environmental, it's going into social, it's going into justice, it's going into all of these other things. So we really have to expand our minds there. But I really think also for a lot of us in our work to be able to be a sustainability professional, inherently a lot of us were able to go to college. We work with people who spend their time on these issues. We're highly educated. We're maybe able to take less money and follow our passion. And that's something that a lot of people don't have the ability to do. We're also able to spend a lot of time with people who share our views. I'm sure a lot of people on this call, if you work in the sustainability industry, you have the same vision for the world that I do. And I think a lot of other people don't get to spend a lot of time with those who do share that. So I think it's often we have to remind ourselves that, we get to see the world and have this vision for the world that a lot of other people don't.
Can you talk about, just to personalize it a little bit, just your lived experience joining the sustainability field and what that was like?
Yeah, for sure. So I think for me, like Jarami, I was always interested in science. I was the kid that wanted a microscope for Christmas in 3rd grade and was going outside and like picking leaves and looking at it under a microscope. So I always was interested and wanted to do something with that. But I think, my community and my teachers, even my parents, I was privileged enough to have both of my parents go to college and know about college and wanted me to go. But even they tried to push me in the direction of medicine or healthcare or teaching. And I think that kind of ties into what do, a lot of people of color define as success. I think for a lot of us, it is that title, like, oh, my child was the first in our family to go to law school or med school or make $1 million or start their own business. I think that's where a lot of people are tying their success to in our communities. And it's because there's those barriers, right? There's those systems that say there's not many doctors of color. There's not many, entrepreneurs of color. You don't see yourself represented in a lot of spaces. And so we're tying our success to what we see. And so for me, once I got to college, I was able to pick whatever I wanted. And I think that's a privilege in and of itself. I decided I don't want to do biology. I want to do environmental studies. I wanted to not be stuck in a lab. I don't like blood. It would not be a good if I was going to be a doctor, but I would have been able to check that box. So I think for me, it was kind of not listening to those external forces and really wanting to follow what I wanted to do, but also knowing that, you know, I may be the only one in those spaces as well. So it's definitely an intersection of a lot of different things, but really wanting to do what you're interested in, but also make that difference. And also, you know, kind of convincing your community, convincing your parents, and explaining to your grandma what sustainability is really hard. And so kind of going through all of that.
Before we jump into the breakouts, I know you worked with Americorps to increase the number of low income and first generation and underrepresented groups to complete higher education. So I just wanted to ask if you could quickly just talk about what you saw during that time and what those kind of like barriers to entry were.
Yeah, for sure. So I worked for a few years in a high school here in North Carolina. So really working with those students who are in a rural community, who are underrepresented, who are students of color, who maybe, you know, first generation to this country students. And so I think, you know, very similarly, they know the career paths that they know. They know doctor and nurse. You know, they understand that I should go to college, but they don't know all of the array of opportunities that are there. And so I think we really have to be intentional as, you know, leaders in the sustainability space if we want to kind of open that pipeline of how do we include those folks. You know, they may be interested, you know, they might have something cultivated in that. How do we really take that and plant the seed, or even, you know, with workers, how do we kind of increase representation? I think so. There's a lot of those barriers and those systems. Think that we can't do everything, but I can promise you that, you know, all those little small steps that you can do. You can offer a paid internship, if you can mentor a student, if you can, you know, speak up when you hear, you know, something that's racist or sexist at work. All of those small things add up, and they do make a difference and kind of do widen that pipeline. So I think specifically, you know, looking at youth, you never know who can come up and you want them to have that better world and to be able to pursue their dreams and, you know, make a difference. But also just working with your peers and interacting with, you know, those our age and older to really kind of create those paths and widen that gap.
Thank you so much, Taylor. I think it's both of you shared really important perspectives for us to think about as sustainability professionals. And so I would keep that in mind. And as we're about to jump into our first breakout session, and before we do, I just want to emphasize the importance of vulnerability and self-awareness in this process. We're all in different parts of this anti-racism journey, and it's important that we have self-awareness around that so we can actually take concrete steps forward. So we're about to reflect in a group, and we encourage utilizing this space in this time as brave space. I know we're all really familiar with safe spaces, but this is a time for brave spaces for non-BIPOC people to have challenging conversations and authentic conversations around race and how to address that in every aspect of your life. Thank you for bearing with us through that technical difficulty, but hopefully the breakout rooms were worth it. Thank you. So in the second half, we're going to focus a little more on how to activate and move this conversation forward. So Sam, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I'm here.
Thanks.
Can you hear me?
I can, and I know we lost a little bit of time, so hopefully we'll be quick in getting our points across. But I just want you to start off as well with just giving your name and your title and why the intersection of race and sustainability matters.
Yeah. So, hey everyone, thank you for joining us. And, you know, I just wanted to say before I dive in, just like, thank you to Drami and Taylor for taking your time to share your stories with us, your emotional and mental energy with us, and to be here today. And, you know, in the groups that we were just in, thank you to everyone to share those perspectives. You know, I was in a group of talking about what it means from this white ally perspective, but there's also Asian American and Latinx perspective. So it's nice to have everyone kind of like listen to each other. So again, thank you all for doing that. And it's just like a good reminder too, when I was thinking about it, that, you know, Drami and Taylor and all of us are giving each other this generous gift, because really this like onus of learning and what it means, or like how to be anti-racist, you know, really should be self-directed. And like as Veena iterated from the beginning, doesn't fall on the shoulders of BIPOC people and communities. But quick little bit about me. I'm Sam Hartsock. I'm one of QB's co-founders. QB stands for Queen Bee. Me and my other co-founder in this chat too, she's here today, Noemi. We started this firm. We set out to be unapologetic ourselves. We were inspired by the bees, their intricate collaborative beehive, and, you know, of course, Beyonce. So there is that. What we do is strategy and communications for companies ready to actualize people-first sustainability vision. A little about me, and then kind of like why the intersection of race and sustainability matters to me is because, frankly, you know, like if we aren't taking an anti-racist or an equity lens, you know, acknowledging how insidious white supremacy is and all the things we do from our passions. So like for me, I'm a fly fisher, so that means admitting to the racism and like actively unraveling its history of systemic racism and conservation, and how, you know, there are no BIPOC people who are fly fishers as well. It also means that in how we understand data, how we tackle problems, how we build teams, how we design solutions, all those activities we love to do with within sustainability, we're taking that lens, right? Because if we're not, we're doing society a disservice, and we're perpetuating this status quo, and more importantly, like we're not generally living our values. So, you know, the prevalent whiteness in sustainability was also like a significant reason why Noemi and I started our firm in the first place. You know, we both looked around at places where we work, and who we saw was a majority of cisgendered white people from the same couple business schools, from the same graduate programs, from the same backgrounds. And so we knew that there was this immediate and necessary need to see more of diversity in sustainability. And also, of course, we saw a lot of white men still at that consistent top leadership role, even though we know this field is permeated with brilliant women at all other levels of the sustainability space. So QB is our way of taking action, or like one of our ways of taking action to try to create change. You know, we want to bring more, by starting a firm, we wanted to be able to bring more diversity to the sustainability field, especially sustainability consulting, and so that we have diverse teams designing solutions that are centered on and for the benefit of BIPOC people.
I know you kind of are touching on this already, but can you talk about what active allyship means and what that looks like in real time, especially in the context of the sustainability profession?
Yeah. So a lot of what we all just reflected on too. You know, with this is all like hella personal work. Like we have to have self-awareness, we have to have reflection, and we have to have humility, because you know, and I know I will, and maybe even tonight, we're going to mess up, right? And so it's like understanding of self-reflection, awareness, and humility is necessary for this anti-racism journey. It's also a focus on, you know, continually acknowledging where you are on your anti-racism journey, because you're going to continually be learning, continually unlearning on what you need to do. And you'll have some things that you do learn that will shake you to your core along the way. And hopefully you grab on to those moments and use that energy to run with. That may come from reading a book, from news, from protesting, from a friend, you know, but when those moments really shake you, be open to reflecting after you've been shook I know for B, one of those moments was right after the presidential election. And one of my closest friends and coworkers who I'd been working with for about 3.5 years now, she's also a fellow Texan like me. She was sitting next to me. She's a BIPOC woman. She turned to me, looked me straight in the eyes and said, "It is not my responsibility to educate your family. It is not my responsibility to talk to your aunts and to your uncles." And to me, I hadn't made that, you know, admittingly, which is hard, I hadn't made that connection about talking about racism with my family. It was like what I did with my work. It was what I did with kind of like the job I used to have, but it wasn't in my familiar life, or like I was acknowledging that that was hard and I didn't know what to do, so I didn't talk about it. And so that moment shook me. And since then, I've kind of made it a core focus of mine to talk about racism with my family, to have, you know, weekly book readings with my mom when I would usually read with my friends. So I think it's like holding on to those moments that wake you and running with that, right? So we have to have this understanding, and we have to know that we have this responsibility. And with each understanding, with each learning, comes more responsibility that you can't put down. So that's the other thing to keep in mind, is like, as you learn, your responsibility grows. And we really, you know, as again, you can't ever put down, or you can't ever not use this equity lens. And I think that's the big thing for us to all keep in mind as we're thinking about, like, what does it mean to be active in our allyship, or just active in creating a more equitable world, right? This is your new always lens. So to view your home life, how will you raise your kids if you're into having those, or, you know, your new work life, how are you designing your tools? How are you advocating for new people to join your team, or, you know, within your community, how are resources distributed? Who are the people that are like buying houses in your community? What's that access? So it's just like taking this audit of your life in this new way and learning. A little bit of what I've done.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we jump quickly, could you just end with, I know it's something we talk about a lot, just one of the common pitfalls that we see with allyship.
Okay, you're right. We had a lot more that we were talking about. Okay, let's see.
The main thing I just wanted to talk about was, you know, our tendency to center ourselves, and
Yep.
And always like having to remind ourselves over and over again not to do that.
Yep. Yeah, so I think the 2 points here, what we are thinking about is, one, especially knowing we're all sustainability professionals, we all probably got master's degrees because that's been this level of access that our field has required for some reason. We all love to learn. And I think a big part of it is knowing when you've had enough learning, it's time to act. So remembering that, you know, if you aren't acting with your learning, you're perpetuating the society you're trying to dismantle, you're perpetuating the racism in this space. And so knowing that, you know, we can't freeze in our learning and we need to act, that's part of like a massive part of like being an ally. And then, yeah, me and Veena were kind of having this conversation a lot as we were prepping, that especially as Americans, and I think especially as like white Americans, we tend to center ourselves. And this is definitely the moment to, you know, step back and listen and understand where you can be an ally, and just, but that's going to be difficult, right? That's where a humility piece comes in. So constantly realizing, like, how can I take myself and the learnings I've had, I don't need to share them out with everyone with every specific thing, to have my diatribe, but it's more about like, who are you serving and how are you making their lives better, and just continually working to take yourself out of that. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Sam.
Yep.
Lisa, can you unmute yourself? Great.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
I can. So if you can give us your name, your title, and why the intersection of race and sustainability matters.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Hu. I use she, her, hers. I'm the Energy Equity Program Manager at a nonprofit called the Green Lining Institute, which I'll talk about in a second. And I live and work in West Oakland, and my work is really focused on what I would describe as exactly this intersection of racial injustice, climate change, and energy equity. So maybe what I can do is kind of take a point from the folks before me and just speak kind of personally. For me, you know, I was involved in a lot of harmful systems when I was a kid, and so learned self-advocacy out of necessity. And that really birthed this desire to think about public policy as the opportunity to affect change at scale. And so this examination of like, how do we analyze, disrupt, and transform power, I feel like has been at the heart of how I think about vulnerabilities and therefore why I do the kind of work that I do. And policy is just one tool, right, that takes us to the work. Other tools can be regulations and legislation, organizing, arts. And in the different kinds of policy work that I was doing around environment, health, economic development, water security, I was seeing across all of these different artificial silos what I was seeing in my lived experiences too, which is that the communities that I descend from, the communities that raised me, are also the communities that are overwhelmingly the most vulnerable at every possible metric that we look at. And so, decided to study geography to really intentionally look at the spatialization and the racialization of different policies and programs. And where I'm landing is that the answer, the policy answer, the organizing answer is that race-blind and color-blind actions are not actually going to be able to move us forward. And so I work today at an organization called the Greenlining Institute, where we employ a lot of those multiple approaches to social change. And our vision is thriving, resilient communities of color in a future where race is never a barrier. And so in order to achieve that future, it requires us to engage in equity work, to really recognize the differential starting points based on our racialized histories in terms of our legacies of policies and programs and practices. And so that's the kind of ethic that I weave into my research, my policy advocacy, my implementation and coalition building, where I really focus on what we call environmental and social justice communities across California, who tend to be low-income communities of color.
So I know you sit at this really interesting nexus of racial justice and equity and environmental sustainability. So can you just share from your perspective, maybe some of the blind spots that you've seen with the sustainability movement?
Yeah, sure. So this is the benefit of going last, right? A lot of folks have already shared so much wisdom before me. I really want to uplift how Veena started this conversation around this legacy of environmental racism, which is the reason that the environmental justice movement was started in the first place, was out of necessity, because people didn't have access to clean water, clean air, land. And the one thing I'll add to that point is that these are ongoing lived realities, right? This isn't something, we talk about it in a historical dimension because it's important that way, but these are very much live questions. Like Indigenous communities are still demanding clean water, air, land, ongoing fights with oil and gas pipelines and, no DOPL, siting of peaker plants, oil refineries, transit corridors. There's many, many, many dimensions that persist today. And so I think, what I take away from that is the recognition that the energy industry, the sustainability sector, we're not a neutral industry. Like we're inheriting a lot of very deeply racialized impacts, right, that perpetuate today. I think the second part is to think about the ways that, harmful or predatory practices that have really racialized impacts also persist today. Do you think about, again, those same dimensions? You think about Flint, you think about even here in East Oakland, right? Like there was lead in the school's water system and kids weren't able to drink in their own schools. And that's not an accident when you think about the historical dimensions of which schools or communities we invest in and how we know health impacts all of these other parts of your life, right? And so the dangerous part is when we whitewash or erase the fact that Black, Indigenous, and folks of color have really paved the way for this entire movement and are really beating the drum for what are the foundational reasons that we actually talk about environmental justice concepts as being necessary in the sustainability movement. I think then we start to, get very narrow and think, oh, sustainability only means you go to this school or you go to this program or you have this job title. And so we have to really think about it in this broader perspective, which I think helps us understand more entry points, right? And the last thing I'll say about this question is, I think also the way we understand the scope or scale of our challenges has a direct impact on how we determine the scope or scale of our solutions, right? So you think about something as enormous as climate change. Obviously, we know the folks that are going to be hit first and worst by climate change are folks of color. And when we think about that and apply on top of that, for instance, like a COVID lens, right? Like we see actually the way that all of these histories compound over time. So if you look at redlining maps of like the Bay Area, which is where I'm at, and you overlap them with Cal and Virus screen maps, which look at kind of environmental and social vulnerabilities, and then you look at a map of COVID hotspots across the Bay Area, you're looking at basically the same kind of map. The same kinds of communities are like at the bottom every single time. And so it requires this investigation of both like, what do we think is the actual state of things? And therefore, what are the kinds of solutions that we're looking for, right? And so, big questions in California. We have a $54 billion state deficit before the May revise. So where's all the money going to go? Who's going to be prioritized? It's wildfire season, and PSPS is a reality. Who's going to be prioritized in terms of community resilience or access to different kinds of safety measures? And so in order to solve these kinds of challenges, we really have to rethink the full context of what we've inherited and what's happening today, and therefore what the challenges moving ahead are going to look like.
Before we jump into the second breakout, can you just close with how we can expand our values, or really like how having a narrow sense of values does the sustainability movement into service?
Yeah, for sure. I think at the heart of what I'm trying to say is that all of the elements of our work are deeply intersectional, right? So I think that's one really clear takeaway is this invitation to look at the interconnections and see how climate change is also a housing issue, is also a jobs issue, is also an education issue, a health issue. And instead of feeling overwhelmed by that, I hope what that does is actually one, convince us of the urgency, and two, get us excited about the kinds of solutions then that are possible, or the kinds of partnerships that are possible, right? I think, one part that I've noticed is this narrow-mindedness, not just in terms of our history, but also, for instance, like what we're actually trying to move the needle on. The more that folks really focus on, for instance, specific metrics that are primarily about maybe emissions reductions or number of social media interactions, like whatever the metric is that you're looking at, I think those metrics reveal a lot about how we prioritize our labor and how we actually engage with our work, and to what extent we are being anti-racist versus kind of perpetuating continued systems of harm, right? And so, for instance, disaggregating data by neighborhood, by race, really intentionally trying to look at the gaps. Those are different ways that we can try and infuse a lot more equity through that process. And I think, another thing I want to offer is you all are here because you self-identify as valuing social impact and sustainability. And so I think, I want to offer this invitation to really wrestle with and unpack like why those values really matter to you, and then invite these new contours to think through those challenges, right, around people, like who benefits, where are they, what do they want, who's included, who's at the table, who actually is able to partake in the kinds of solutions that we're creating, the kind of buildings that we're offering, the industry that we're shaping, any of that. And so I'll close by saying part of this is about analysis, and I think part of this is also about imagination. And we can't afford to think of a challenge as enormous as climate change, or a sector as large as sustainability, narrowly or incompletely. Part of what I love about this moment that we're in right now, where everything kind of feels like it's collapsing, it's also a moment of potential, right? And so a lot of movement for Black Lives organizers, for instance, are saying, and knitting together like why the movement for Black Lives is also really foundational to how we view climate change, if we can imagine a future, for instance, that doesn't have fossil fuels, if we can imagine completely reworking our economy and all of our buildings and all of our industries, the entire grid, we can surely imagine a future where communities of color, especially Black communities, are thriving, right? And so part of this, like I said, it's analysis, part of it's an imagination. And I think that, you know, the more value-driven we can be in that, the more we can think about what are the new kinds of metrics that we need to include to help guide our work that can be more values aligned. I think those are really exciting things that I hope folks, you know, on this call and also other folks that work in sustainability will really want to investigate.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I think that's a perfect transition to our last breakout, and we're going to try this again and we'll see if it works. And as we're doing this, I just want to remind everyone that we have a lot more power as individuals than we realize, and the systems that benefit from us thinking that we're powerless. So the time for being passive bystanders is over, and you're going to be discussing in your groups how you can bring that racial equity lens to your workplace. So hopefully we'll see if the breakout sessions work.
Yes, thank you, Veena, and I'm pushing everyone into rooms. Hopefully it will go smoothly. Thank you.
Thank you, Rishi.
Hey, Bennett.
Oh,
hey. Hi. I tried to, I think, assign you to a breakout room, but it's totally optional and we can chat too.
Okay, great. I think I was in it. I just didn't hit a button fast enough.
Okay, let me try again.
So I think I see the.
Hi, everyone. I think everyone's trickling back in. I hope you had interesting conversations, and we are hoping that this is just the beginning and that we continue to find ways to hold each other accountable as a community and to keep this momentum going. So I think we have quite a few people that need to come back, actually. But we are nearing the end of our time. So also thank you for spending an hour and a half with us. And we will be sending a take-home call to action checklist as a follow-up that just kind of reiterates some of the points that the panelists brought up.
Nice meeting you guys.
And also just a quick reminder to mute yourself again as you come into the room. But yeah, so we'll be sending a take-home call to action checklist that just reiterates some of the points that the panelists brought up. And again, the goal is to remind you that you have power to create the environments that you're in and to create the world that we want to live in. And so every day you should be taking actions to educate yourself, to reflect, to act, and all of these things need to be happening simultaneously, because I know we often have the tendency to freeze, especially in the education piece. And so, just to really hammer this point home, anti-racism is a lifelong journey with no end. So right now we're tasked with how to actively integrate racial equity into the identity of a sustainability professional, and how to apply the anti-racism lens to impact work. Because we're not doing our jobs if we are not creating a sustainable future for everyone. So hopefully you learned something about yourself, you have some takeaways in the breakout session. Or maybe you met someone to have accountable conversations with. And I just wanted to end with saying, look around. This is a community of people who are on this journey with you and who care about the same things. So utilize each other. It's a beautiful thing to have community. If you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to reach out to me. My email is veena@consultqb. And that's really it. Thank you guys so much. Ella, do you want to close out?
Yeah, I would just love to say again, thank you all so much for being here, for mentally being here and being active in this space, for being vulnerable and sharing your stories, and also for dealing with our technical difficulties. We appreciate you guys that stuck it out to the end. Please stay tuned to Net Impact Chapter comms for more follow-up events and conversations like this. We recognize that, to create real change, this needs to be something sustainable that continues on. So we will be having more conversations similar to this, and just really look forward to continuing that with all of you guys. So thank you so much for being here. And look out for a follow-up email soon with some of those call to actions and some links and things. So appreciate it all. Thank you guys.
Thanks, Ella. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
everyone. Bye.
Thanks.
I forgot to thank you, panelists, again.
Thank you. And thank you for bearing with the difficulties.
It worked. Thank you I'm sure that must have been stressful, so thank you.
Yeah, no, we didn't think about the scenario where what if someone would reject to join and it kept freezing, but we figured out. Yeah.
Lesson learned.
You can't give people choices. That's the learning. No choices. You're going in a breakout room.
Yeah, like you have to move. Great.
I think everyone's trickling back in. I hope you had interesting conversations, and we are hoping that this is just the beginning and that we continue to find ways to hold each other accountable as a community and to keep this momentum going. So I think we have quite a few people that need to come back, actually. But we are nearing the end of our time. So also thank you for spending an hour and a half with us. And we will be sending a take-home call to action checklist as a follow-up that just kind of reiterates some of the points that the panelists brought up.
Nice meeting you guys.
And also just a quick reminder to mute yourself again as you come into the room. But yeah, so we'll be sending a take-home call to action checklist that just reiterates some of the points that the panelists brought up. And again, the goal is to remind you that you have power to create the environments that you're in and to create the world that we want to live in. And so every day you should be taking actions to educate yourself, to reflect, to act, and all of these things need to be happening simultaneously, because I know we often have the tendency to freeze, especially in the education piece. And so, you know, just to really hammer this point home, anti-racism is a lifelong journey with no end. So right now we're tasked with how to actively integrate racial equity into the identity of a sustainability professional, and how to apply the anti-racism lens to impact work. Because we're not doing our jobs if we are not creating a sustainable future for everyone. So hopefully you learned something about yourself, you have some takeaways in the breakout session. Or maybe you met someone to have accountable conversations with. And I just wanted to end with saying, you know, look around. This is a community of people who are on this journey with you and who care about the same things. So utilize each other. It's a beautiful thing to have community. If you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to reach out to me. My email is veena@consultqb. And that's really it. Thank you guys so much. Ella, do you want to close out?
Yeah, I would just love to say again, thank you all so much for being here, for mentally being here and being active in this space, for being vulnerable and sharing your stories, and also for dealing with our technical difficulties. We appreciate you guys that stuck it out to the end. Please stay tuned to Net Impact Chapter comms for more follow-up events and conversations like this. We recognize that, you know, to create real change, this needs to be something sustainable that continues on. So we will be having more conversations similar to this, and just really look forward to continuing that with all of you guys. So thank you so much for being here. And look out for a follow-up email soon with some of those call to actions and some links and things. So appreciate it all. Thank you guys.
Thanks, Ella. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.